All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is January 21st of 2022. Happy Friday, everybody. Thanks for tuning into the stream. We have 11 NBA games on tap for tonight, 8 NHL games on tap. NFL lurking here for the weekend coming up, divisional round of the playoffs. We are in the midst of the American Express tournament for golf, so a lot of DFS going on, a lot of exciting things to talk about right now in the DFS space. Decent little MMA card, I think, for this weekend too. Sounds like a lot of fights canceled on that one, so maybe not so good or not as good as we were expecting. But anyway, a lot to talk about here today. I see some questions in our queue. We've got plenty of ideas to talk about. A few questions about removing players from your pool. Actually, surprisingly, a lot of questions about removing players from your pool, ranging from how to do it. So we'll talk about that. We'll do kind of a quick demo here of that. And then also kind of, what the implications are of doing that, or different strategies of player pool curation overall. I see quite a few questions on that here. Couple questions, or at least a question about variance here, late swap. So decent little queue of questions in front of us here for today's stream, but all things considered, not too busy, at least to start here. So if you've got a question for me, probably a good day to ask it. Go ahead and get it in the queue. I think every day is a good day to ask questions here, but on these days where I don't have too many questions in front of me right when we start the stream, I'll be able to get to these questions that come in live a little bit faster. So as always, I answer these things here in about the order they come in. So the sooner you get your question in, the sooner I will get to it. But without much further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in. Let me get the app pulled up. Looks like Chris is here. Chris is excited. Welcome, Chris. Let's go ahead and jump right in here. I'm going to start again. We'll just start here with the last question I got yesterday afternoon. And this was kind of more on the feature request side of things. This is from Andrew. And he said, are late swap larger pools coming this NBA season? This is something I've been talking about quite a bit here. Just something that we want to do for the product, give you the ability to have a pool when you're late swapping so that you can adjust exposures and things like that here on the fly in the late swap, just like you can for a normal build. I don't want to make any promises about this is coming this NBA season. We just talked this week amongst our team and kind of reinforced amongst us here that this is important. This is a big priority. This is something we really want to get out. It is technically a little bit more of an intensive project, requires a little bit more reworking the way that the builder kind of works and the late swap builder works in the first place. So we understand, we know for a fact this is going to be something that will make a big difference for everybody. We're even excited about this as users of the product here, but it's a little bit of a bigger project for sure. So I don't want to make a promise or anything like that it is coming this NBA season, but I will say it is on our roadmap, I guess, to start work on basically as soon as we are finished with the features that we're working on right now. So stay tuned there. We know that will be a big difference maker for everybody once that is out, but wanted to touch on that one right at the start. Had a question from TBK asking about the SaberSim logo. Basically, why is everybody wearing a SaberSim logo? I dropped a link in the Office Hours channel Slack, or I dropped a link into the Office Hours channel in Slack to our Winners Circle, which in case you didn't know, maybe you're watching this here for the first time or new to SaberSim, we do have pretty slick rewards if you use the SaberSim logo as your avatar on FanDuel, DraftKings, or Yahoo, or any of the sites, and ship a top 5 finish for $1,000 or more. And then it kind of just scales up from there. There's more goodies at 10K. There's more goodies at 100K and so on. Everything ranging from SaberSim swag to SaberSim credit to all kinds of stuff. So definitely check that out. That is why you are seeing the SaberSim logos at the top of the leaderboard every night en masse. But which brings us actually then to our kind of first question here, more on the strategy side for today. And this is from my boy, Ruben. Glad Ruben popped a question in here, but he said, what are your thoughts on using different slates on a given night to spread out variance for teams that overlap slates? Meaning like taking one stand on the main slate and using the later slate as a hedge. I'll tell you this, so that I've been talking about this a little bit here recently, especially the last couple weeks, and I am getting more and more interested in the idea of spreading out variance by playing a lot of different slates on a given night. So I know on one hand, you sacrifice a little bit of expected value, right? Because these contests, we've talked about this before, the contests that you're going to get in NBA Showdown and on the Turbo and the night slates and things like that, there's going to be less effective entrants, maybe contests that play a little bit sharper. Your lineups may have a lower expected value than they do in the really big, soft, big contests that you see on the main slate. But a couple things. One, you just get more lineups in play. You get more shots on goal. And if you've seen some of my other videos about variance in DFS, you know that kind of the more slates you are getting in, the more lineups you are getting into slates, and the more slates you are getting in, the more you're going to give yourself a shot to realize your expected value, assuming you're a profitable player, more quickly. So I've been playing these. I've been playing turbos. I've been playing night slates. I've been playing a lot of the showdowns. And I think it is worth it. I think it's a good idea. The other thing here, and I don't know if necessarily I would take the approach that I'm going to directly hedge my lineups. I haven't been doing that as much in terms of taking one stand here and maybe making a more aggressive stand on the showdown or the turbo, right? Maybe you fade the Lakers in the, well, actually, it's not a good example. There's a 5:30 turbo tonight, right? So maybe you're fading like the Celtics completely in the main slate, and then you play them aggressively in the turbo. You're going to have a lot of that happen naturally, just because the player pools are different between each slate. I haven't been doing any intentional hedging against my lineups in one slate versus the other. A lot of that I think you get naturally through the builder. But what I have noticed, and one of the things that I think is really great about this method of contest selection and slate selection, really, is when you introduce the showdowns and the smaller slates into your contest selection mix, it allows you to silo and group games separately, right? One, if you are very wrong about the way, or maybe not even you, if SaberSim, if the model is very wrong about the way it projects one game on the slate, that can blow your whole main slate, right? If that game is needed and the builder was very under on that slate game, or if that builder, or if the model was very over on that game and that game ended up going well under the total, right? That can basically just kill all 100% of your lineups in the main slate. But if that is the Heat and Hawks game, that doesn't affect your performance in other showdowns or the night slate or the 6 p.m. turbo or things like that. You're still live in all those different slates. And I've noticed this especially for NFL, where you can go and literally, especially on a main slate for not playoffs, but regular season NFL, you can go and play showdowns for every single game on the slate. You have the opportunity to kind of realize the edge of being right on a specific game or a small set of games, even if you're not entirely right about every independent outcome on the main slate. So I think in our contest selection videos for next season for even baseball, but definitely football and basketball, I want to push this a little bit more because I know we didn't really emphasize this in our contest selection stuff this past year. But I think this is a great idea. And I think, I did do some videos here at the start of NBA season talking about how the model can really excel at showdowns, excel at smaller slates because of the way that we're simulating these games out. But I didn't really push emphasizing that kind of contest selection in your overall, in the overall bankroll management and contest selection videos. And I want to do a better job of that next season because I think it's a great idea. I think it will smooth out your variance heavily. Now, you want to be a little careful with that, right? If you're playing 5% of your bankroll already into the main slate, you may need to instead spread that out a little bit amongst many other different slates, right? If all of a sudden you're investing 15% of your total bankroll to play everything, right? Then you are very heavily invested into a bunch of correlated slates on one night. Your risk of ruin is really high. But what I've been doing is I've been taking kind of a similar amount of bankrolls I was playing before and spreading it out over the course of the night. And I found that just gives me more shots to realize my edge on these slates. So I think it's a great idea. But again, I know the original question here was really about like directly hedging your bets. I haven't done that as much, mostly because I think there's more EV in just playing optimally for the given slate that you're playing, right? Rather than you're smoothing, let me put it this way, you're smoothing out your variance enough by just playing the other slates, right? That I'm less concerned about hedging directly my strategy on the main slate with a turbo slate or a night slate. I'd rather just play optimally for each of the 3 different slates that are in play, even if that means that, let's say I'm literally just picking names out of a hat here, but let's say that we're really heavy on the Bucks on both the main slate and the turbo, right? And the 6 p.m. turbo. I'm fine with that. I'm not so concerned about hedging against the Bucks on one of those slates or the other. I think there's just kind of enough variance about getting both of those slates in play, the showdowns on the slate, the night slate that doesn't include the Bucks game at all, and letting the chips fall where they may. A lot of times too, if a certain team is the best play or being heavy on a certain set of players is optimal for the main slate, it's even more optimal, at least in the case of NBA, for the slate that also includes that team or game and just also has a lot less options to pivot anyway, right? So, but anyway, good question. Glad I had an opportunity to talk a little bit more about that, because it's made a big difference for me in the second half or so here of NBA, and I definitely think it's a good idea. So awesome question, Ruben. Thank you for sending that one in. And then so we get to some of these questions here. I know we have a question from TBK. These are about removing players from your player pool. So what we'll do is kind of a convenient string of questions here. So TBK says, how do I remove players from my player pool? I've unchecked them in step 1, but some show up in step 3 after building lineups, and then some that I had in my player pool end up getting grayed out. And then we had a question from Chuck Gravity here. He said, trial user coming from Fantasy Labs. Welcome, first of all, Chuck. But he said, I wasn't able to eliminate any Lakers from my sim. So we'll talk about this here at more of a basic level first of how to do these things. A couple things to look out for here. If you're running into issues from there, how to report these issues. And then I see some follow-up questions here about more kind of strategy of adjusting your player pool. So I think this will be a good kind of little full segment of talking about this here. But first of all, let's do this first. You want to remove a player pool from your pool, right? The how-to is to uncheck these players. And it seems like TBK here understands how to do this. You mentioned here that I've unchecked them in step 1. This is kind of the how-to. I would make sure, if you've run a build, that if you come back here, these guys are still removed from your pool, that something didn't end up happening. You didn't accidentally put that back in here. I would check. If you want to, Chuck, in your case here, if you're trying to eliminate a whole team, the easiest way to do that is up here in the team selections. There's this little icon here, this little X. And if you want to remove the Lakers, you can just X all of the Lakers out at once. And that'll remove them from your pool completely. And then when we go in here and build this, we'll just run a quick build here on default settings to demo this. And I should be able to actually view the entire pool of 500 and validate that we have 0 Lakers in the entire pool. And Giannis was the other guy we unchecked, that we have 0% of these players here. So give this just a second. Okay, so this is up now, and we can look at our entire pool of 500 lineups, and let's search for Lakers. So no Lakers, that's good. No Giannis, that's good. Now, that's not to say there might be something going wrong here. If you run this exact process, you've eliminated players from your pool, right? You've eliminated teams, and you're still seeing them showing up in your lineups, right? Let us know. And I would say specifically the easiest way to let us know, first of all, I would say go back to step 1 and just, validate that these players are actually removed, right? In this case, they are. But the easiest way to let us know in a way that we can kind of act on would be to go up to this settings thing here, click report a problem, and type in, I removed, well, maybe not all caps, that's a little intense, but I removed Giannis and he's still showing up. And what this will do is this will send us a link to a recording of your session so we can follow along and figure out exactly what's going on here. It's a lot easier than kind of trying to piece it together ourselves. There might be something we're missing there, but those are the easiest ways to do that here. I will say this too, another option that you can do is you can remove players from your pool in step 3. Right? One of the things that is really cool about SaberSim is that you don't have to do everything before you build lineups. You can do things after the lineups are built. And then what we'll do is we'll sort through, say you're playing 20 lineups and this is your pool, right? And you decide after you've built the lineups that you don't want to play Troy Brown, right? Clearly the model kind of likes him here, but cheap player, right? Maybe inconsistent with minutes for whatever reason. You want to take a stand there. You want to fade him. You can just uncheck him here and remove him from your pool of lineups. So if you want to make big changes or you have an understanding of who you want to build your lineups with in the first place, you should always do that in step 1, because that means the overall pool of lineups that we're building for you is a better fit for the overall strategy you want to use to tackle on the slate. But if you want to make some final tweaks and updates and things like that in step 3, I think that's all great. That is why it is here. So, but all right. So it looks like that worked for Chuck. So glad to see that. I would say TBK, again, I'd give that another try, double check, make sure that these guys are unchecked here. When you go back to step 1, make sure they're still unchecked. If you run into an issue where the guy is literally unchecked in step 1, showing up in lineups in step 3, that's certainly a bug. We would want to see that. So use that report a problem I showed in settings and we'll figure out what's going on there. But I think if you make sure that that guy is gone, he shouldn't show back up for you there in step 3. Just since I know that the original kind of language, let me look at the original language of this message here. So this says some of the players I had in my player pool end up getting grayed out. I wanted to touch on that just for a moment here and just kind of mention that, you know, you can't roster everybody, right? So the way that this question is written, I just kind of want to make sure that it's clear that just having a player in your player pool doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get exposure to them, right? Jokic is in our player pool, right? He was checked in step 1. We don't have any exposure to Jokic. And that's kind of just a limitation of you can't have a exposure to every single player in the pool. Now, as long as this player is checked in step 1 and included in step 1, we can add exposure to him. We could go get 20% exposure to Jokic here in step 3, right? And that works. So now he's showing up in 20% of our lineups. But just the way that this question here says, you know, I had some that I had in my player pool end up getting grayed out. That'll happen because we can't have exposure to everybody. So, but you certainly should get 0% exposure even in your broader pool of 500 or 1,500 lineups to any player you uncheck in step 1. But anyway, I'm going to move on here. And what we'll do, we'll keep talking a little bit more about some of these other questions here about the player pool. So good kind of follow up here to go from there. So Nancy Drew guy says, so the guys that SaberSim automatically blacks out, do you think we should add those guys back in like Big T did? So what we're referring to here is by default, for most slates, most sport types, let's go ahead and add these guys back into our pool real quick here. We have this player filter. So you click this, step 1, review player pool. Directly to the right of that is this player filter icon. By default, we'll have this rule that will typically say something like include players where my projection is greater than X, where X changes based on the sport and the slate and the every other variables there. But for most NBA classic slates, this will be 15. And what this means is that by default, we're going to filter out every player projected for less than 15 points. And this is just our bulk way of just kind of removing a bunch of lower projected players that probably won't be showing up in the lineups a bunch anyway. But, you know, we don't want these guys that I think the main reason that we filter these guys out is that the lower a player's minutes projection or fantasy points projection or any of these projections gets, the more being wrong on these players is kind of creates a big relative difference, right? So it's easier to be kind of wrong in the way that we're projecting these players. Anyway, it's easier to just eliminate a lot of these players from the pool right off the bat. So that's what we do. Now, you don't have to do this, right? You can actually probably just remove this completely, right? Let's do a test real quick just to see, because I think it'd be interesting to demo this. So we're going to remove the filter completely, right? And then just run another build and we'll see what is the lowest overall projected player that we're getting in our pool and how much of them are we getting. And I think we'll see that, you know, in this case, we may not have needed that filter at all. I think it's probably unlikely that we get a single player in our top 20 that is projected for under 15, but it's there kind of as a backstop just to kind of protect against, you know, very low projected players from showing up in your lineups. So let's just look at this real quick because I think this is interesting to see. So what we'll do, we'll sort by projection and let's scroll down and see the last player that we are. There's a ton of players in the pool, so it's a little tricky to do this here easily. But we've got a couple players that are projected for. Actually, I think the easiest way to do it would be to just scan it myself because there's so many players in the pool. So I think we had a couple players. We have a player projected for 18 points, but he would have showed up anyway. That's about it. A couple players projected for 18. So in this case, the filter's not even really doing that much at all. But this question says, should I go back and add these players in? I was on the Run Pure stream with Big T and AP yesterday, and honestly, Big T just had a pretty impressive call on Jose Alvarado. Said that he was projected for like 8 points, said that he thought he was an interesting play on last night's slate. So he lowered that filter and bumped up Alvarado's projection quite a bit. And sure enough, Alvarado ended up having a great game. I think he went like 9x at min salary. So great call by Big T there. I would say this. I would say rather than the conclusion there being, I'm just going to remove the player filter because clearly these guys that are lowly projected have a shot at upside. They do. I think the better conclusion there is that especially on small slates where you need to take some shots to get some lower ownership, it's fine to go digging and looking for maybe some of those lower projected value plays. I don't know if you need to go that far on an 11-game slate like we have tonight. But if there's a guy that's projected for under 15 points or something like that, that maybe for an injury reason or some inconsistency in minutes, right? I don't know. Let's see where the value, where's the value on tonight's slate at the moment? Let's see. Chicago, Memphis is still interesting. Let's take a look at Memphis. So here's a good example, right? Jarrett Culver is actually like probably a perfect example, right? Maybe you tell me, the Grizzlies are still a little banged up. There's been some inconsistency on where the minutes are going anyway, right? D'Anthony Melton's a pretty good example. Maybe it's a situation that Culver gets a little bit more run, and I want him to at least be available for my lineups. I think the easiest thing to do in this case would be to just give him maybe a little bit of a nudge on the projection, right? So that he comes out. Okay, that's actually a pretty big nudge per value. Maybe we bump him to like 16 points. So he at least comes out of that filtered range. And now we're basically saying to the builder, like, you can use this player. He's not filtered out anymore. He presents as a decent value. You might get him in a little bit of lineups. If you want to bump up his projection more or his exposure more, you'll at least get him. So just to kind of clarify on this question, what I wouldn't do is I wouldn't just say, Big T got it right. Remove the filter. Let all the players into your pool. I don't think that's necessarily the right approach, but I do think, especially on smaller slates, going and looking at some of those players that might be getting filtered out or dropping your filter down a little bit can be a good idea of a way to get maybe some lower owned plays that have a shot at some minutes upside into your lineups. So I typically, on slates that are smaller than about 4 to 5 games for NBA, I start experimenting with this bringing filter number down a little bit. So on a 3-game slate, I might end up at like 12 points here instead. On a 2-game slate, I might end up at like 8 or 9 points here. Just there's less players in the pool. I want to start getting access to some of those guys that don't play as many minutes, maybe don't have as high as a projection, but still, in a single NBA game, in a slate size where we need to embrace a lot of variance, might be worth including them in there. But good question, and obviously a pretty spectacular call by Big T last night on the Alvarado play. So it was pretty impressive. But okay, cool. Shelby says, just wondering if this is possible. If I create my own lineup in any sport, is there a way to load the lineup in and see what the projections would be? Thanks. Interesting question. Not one I have had asked before. I don't think there is a very straightforward way to just doing this. I think what the easiest thing to do would be is lock, and this actually came up on the stream yesterday. You're not going to be able to lock every single player into the lineup, but I would say you can probably lock most of them in. I would say if you want to lock 4, 5, or 6 of them in and then run other lineups around it, then you could. So let's say, for example, right, let's kind of like, I'm going to try to just do this here. Let's build the lineup. So let's say like your lineup was Giannis, and then what we'll do is we'll just kind of build some of these value plays in so that I know that the builder will be okay with this. I'm trying to do this in a way that doesn't also mess it up because of the way that positions come together. But let's do like this, right? You could take these 5 locked players, and then build 500 lineups around it or something like that, and then find your actual lineup and see how it projects. I'm not sure if that's easier than just getting a calculator out and adding the projections up by one, to be completely honest. It might be. It depends on what you find easier. I mean, I think probably that maybe the simplest approach here would be to literally just look up each player that you have in the lineup and add up their projections on a calculator and see what that number comes out to. But this would be an alternative here. So again, so we locked 5 players in. We're basically going to get 500 lineups with a bunch of other combinations of those remaining 3 players. And then we could kind of go figure out what the other players were that were in the lineups. Maybe even just by using the locks, right? So maybe one of the other players that was in the lineup was Ja Morant. And then maybe it was Bam. Eventually, we're going to need to bring this down to 1. So maybe this ends up being the lineup, right? So maybe this was the lineup you built for yourself. Now you kind of, in a roundabout way, ended up at the projected score. But again, it might have just been easier to just add these up for yourself. So, but interesting question. I think it's the first time I've answered that one. So I think that's probably the easiest way to do it. I don't know. It might just be easier to just add up the player projections for yourself. But good question. And then Spiral, another question here, kind of more about that player pool curation. So let's bump back to step 1 here for a minute. And we'll talk about this here. Let's reset everything, first of all. Okay. So question says, if I wanted to create NBA lineups using only 30 or so players that I select, could SaberSim create lineups using only those players? And would they still be optimum ones or just pieced together on salary fit? So interesting question. First of all, you certainly can do this. There's nothing wrong with curating your player pool to the point of, the 30 or so players that you're comfortable playing. In fact, if we jump back to the first build we built today, for, depending on how many lineups you're playing, if you were playing 150 lineups, a 30-person player pool is pretty tight. But for 20 or so lineups, I actually think that's pretty realistic, right? Tonight's slate, 11 games, 20 lineups on default settings. We get 36 players, right? So that's actually kind of what the builder does for you already, is it kind of says, for your 20 lineups, here's the 30-ish players, depending on the size of the slate that makes sense to use. So there's certainly nothing wrong with saying that, these are the plays that I want to use, and I'm going to set that beforehand. If you had just 30 players that you want to use for your lineups, I would absolutely recommend setting that. I would actually say you almost certainly have to set that before your build, because if you set it after the build, right, what's going to happen is, well, if you set it after the build, you're probably not going to be able to filter through the lineups and find 20 that only have those 30 particular players. So you'll want to set this level of player pool curation before the build. The second part of this question gets kind of interesting. I wouldn't say, so would they be optimal ones or just pieced together on salary fit? On a technical level, neither of those things are actually the case. So here's what will happen. So what will happen is you will have your 30 players, right, available for the lineup. And we will still go through the process of, when we build the first lineup going into your pool, we will select a set of simulations for that particular game, right? And typically what happens there is, after we've selected the sims that are used for that particular lineup, we'll look at all of the player projections we have, right? The fantasy points that players scored in that set of sims. We'll compare it to their ownership, right? We'll use the ownership multiplier. And then we'll pick some first player that goes into the lineup that is probably the highest, overall scoring player in the sims for that set of games, right? If you have a wide open player pool, that can be basically any player playing in the slate. But if you only have 30 players playing in the player pool, that's going to be just kind of the highest overall scoring player of your set of 30. So we will still use the full range of simulations when we're building the lineups, but you've restricted the players that can go into the lineup at that particular point. So put another way, according to the simulations, we are no longer at that point building the optimal lineup for a set of simulations because you've restricted the player pool, but we are building the optimal lineup for a set of simulations based on the player pool you've set. So kind of a little bit of a technicality there, I guess, but I think worth noting there. And in particular, because it is very much not just fitting together the players that project the best on average and what fits together based on salary. You're still getting to take advantage of all the simulation data that we have, and you're building the best possible lineups for a set of simulations, right? Not just who fits based on salary and average projection, but you have kind of limited the availability of players for the builder to pick based on the player pool you've set. So definitely can be a viable strategy. I think I've seen a lot of players have a lot of success with having a pretty curated player pool approach. It's not my approach. I generally leave things a little bit more wide open, but I see no issues with that. The last thing I would note on that is I would always recommend come in here and run a default build, run a test build, as we call it, which would be no adjustments to the player pool and just running it with default settings first and just seeing how that comes out. Because I think it's interesting to see, there may be a player that you're missing, right? There may be a player that has a lot of upside at low ownership or is a good value play or something like that you haven't included in your player pool. And if you ultimately come to the same conclusion that you don't want to play that guy, that's fine. But I think coming in here and immediately trying to input your player pool and never really just seeing how does the model think about the slate on its own is withholding information from yourself. That's valuable information. So I always say start with a test build, start with leaving things kind of wide open in terms of rules and player pool and things like that, and then curate down from there after you've seen an opportunity to see how things are just looking as they are. But good question. So and then Matt says, does the optimizer take late swap into account for flex spots, specifically this weekend with the NFL 4-game 2-day main slate? Will the optimizer put the latest starting skill player in the flex where it can? Yes, it will. It will use the player playing in the latest game in the flex positions where possible, right? Provided that there are players playing in the latest game that can fit into those flex spots. And then in the case of tiebreakers, use the most salary in flex positions where possible. So does that mean, I'm going to leave it on NBA since we have NBA pulled up here already, but let's say you're building a lineup for tonight. Does that mean that you can get a lineup that has only players playing in the first 3 games? Yes. Right. But if you have a lineup that has most of the players playing in the first 3 games and 1 player in the night game player should be in the flex position if he can fit there. Right. So, but good question. And yes, that is, I would say that's that's pretty much automated for you there. If you start becoming kind of opinionated about forcing, let's actually, forget it. Let's go to NFL here because I think it will just get easier to see this doing in the NFL side. If you want to retain flexibility and you want to say, I want some players playing in the later games in every single lineup, at that point, you're better off probably setting a rule. And I would go in here and say something like all lineups must include at least 2 players from the same game and maybe limit this to only the games on Sunday. So that would be these 2. And then you can do something like that. So then you're saying every lineup needs to have at least 2 players from the same game where the 2 games are the Sunday games. And then you're maintaining some flexibility in there if you want to go that route, right? I think where that's most useful, probably less so on a slate like this for NFL, but on NBA, for example, if there was a slate like last night's actually a really good example. We had 1 late game and that game was where all the late value was. If you wanted to say something like, I want at least 1 player from the late game, right? You could do that setting a rule in the rule settings. So. Chris said, does longer hair equate to bigger bankroll? Max just banked and Jordan always banks. Is it time to grow my hair out? It might be the secret. I don't want to come on here and say that it is, but it might be. But Deshaun said, is there any benefits to increasing player pool to 1,500? Would you just keep it as default? Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple benefits. I would say, the main one is that if you find that when you're making adjustments to exposures in step 3, that you're kind of consistently seeing the message that you have to build more lineups, that might be a good opportunity to just bump this up to 1,500. If you leave a lot of your impact on SaberSim in step 3, right? I think some people are a little more focused on making adjustments in step 1. Others like making adjustments in step 3. If you make a lot of adjustments in step 3, you can increase the pool size up to 1,500. Just gives you more flexibility to work with. I would say, and I can't believe we haven't changed this yet. We really just should. I'll leave a note here to maybe write this down so we can actually get this done. I think if you're building more than 150 lineups, 150 or more, I really at that point think it's worth making it 1,500, just because selecting 150 from 500 feels a lot smaller than selecting 150 from 1,500. So if you're playing 150 lineups or more, I would always bump this up. But if you're playing, 20 maxes and stuff like that, I think for the average player, 500 is fine. If you find that you're butting up against that limit of when it says, hey, you need to build more lineups to get this done, then I'd increase it up to 1,500. I think there's a small advantage, maybe especially if you're playing 150 lineups. The other advantage is, when you increase this to 1,500, it's more likely that you're going to end up with a better set of 150, right? If this is 500, each lineup in your 150 was basically choosing from a set of like three and a third lineups and picking what's the best one of these. When this is 1,500, each lineup in your 150 is picking from a set of like 10 lineups and saying which one is the best from these, right? 150 divided by 1,500 is 10. 150 divided by 500 is, a little under a third. So, or the other way around. I mix those two up. You get what I'm saying here, right? So there's a little bit of an advantage to having a bigger pool size the more lineups you're playing, because then the lineups that you end up with will be selected from a wider range. But it's not a huge change either way. It doesn't leave an enormous impact. I mean, the one other thing to consider, and I think less so on NBA, maybe a little more so on sports that have higher correlation and probably have more rules in the way that we're building lineups, you do increase your build time sometimes from 500 to 1,500. So if you're really under the gun, maybe news breaks in NBA and you're trying to update everything at the last second, might not be the best opportunity to increase your pool size to 1,500 if you don't need to. In that case, maybe you just rock and roll with the 500 because the build's going to finish faster. So it's kind of all over the place there. Short answer, if you're playing 150, always increase it to 1,500. That should just be the default value, and I will see if we can make that the default value. Otherwise, mostly a personal preference thing. I would say only build the extra lineups if you feel you need the extra lineups. So, TBK says, is there a certain amount of negative leverage where a player is taken out of the pool of players? Kind of. Let's talk about leverage here. So leverage, let's not get ahead of myself here. Let me just give me a second to pull the build up first. Okay. So what is this leverage column, right? Leverage is your exposure to a player minus the projected ownership for the player. So it's basically a way of saying, this is essentially saying this is the percentage of lineups more that you have on the field for this particular player. And in the case of negative leverage, right, it's the percentage of lineups different that you do not have that player, right? So what it really allows you to do is it allows you to compare players in a way that's a little bit more sophisticated than just raw exposure, right? For example, let's see. So in this case, right, we have, LaMelo Ball is our fifth most exposed player on the slate, right? But he's actually the third most player that we are more exposed to than the field, right? So it's a way of, the players that you have very heavy positive leverage on are the players that when they have a ceiling outcome or a good outcome in the game, your lineups stand to gain more than the field does, because you have that percentage more of lineups, right? Same thing with negative leverage, right? The worst case scenario on this particular slate, assuming the ownership projections were perfectly right, based on this set of lineups would be Derek White or Giannis going off, because those are our players that are the most negatively leveraged. And those are the players that our lineups in relative terms stand to gain the most if they fail. Our lineups stand to gain if those players fail. So in terms of this question, there's not a negative leverage benchmark or milestone after which players just get removed from the pool, but your most negatively leveraged players are almost always going to be the players that you don't have in your player pool at all, right? Because there's no there is no way we could get more negative leverage on Derek White in this set of lineups than fading him completely. Does that make sense? So leverage is kind of more of a representation of, what your total exposure is. And maybe this would help too. So this number will change as our exposure changes, right? So we could, for example, let's pick, here would be a good example, right? So right now we're projecting Jalen Suggs to be the chalkiest player on the slate. If we just go in here and just uncheck him, now our most negatively leveraged player on the entire slate is Jalen Suggs, right? So this number changes as our lineups and player pool changes. So, does that make sense? Hopefully that kind of helps clear that up a little bit. It wouldn't really make sense to say all players under 15% or under negative 10% leverage get removed from the pool, because then, like in the case of Derek White, who's now negative 13.9% leverage, then he would get removed from the pool, and then he would actually jump to negative 18.9, right? So since leverage changes based on the size of the pool, it doesn't make sense to change your pool based on leverage because you get this like circular thing. But it is a very good way. It's a very nice calculation, a nice column to have to kind of visualize, who you're rooting for, what you need to happen on a slate to succeed. So, but good question. That's all I've got in my queue here. No other questions so far. We are about 40 minutes in here, so decent little stream going so far. We definitely have time to cover anything else that you guys want to going into the weekend. I will go ahead and we'll hang out for a few minutes at least and let other questions roll in if you guys have them. Otherwise, we'll get out of here. But should be a interesting little slate here tonight. Always feels very refreshing to me to come back to the bigger, kind of more playable slates after a small slate. I think that the 3-game slates, I'll play it anyway, but not my favorite here. So I noticed something just now, and I think I may have actually seen maybe what's going on here with the player pool thing. So I'm going to try this. Let's try. It seems like actually what I just noticed is that the player pool defaults back to whatever player pool was used for the build you were just viewing. So for example, right, we have everybody in the player pool here in step 1. If we go back to this build that we built without Giannis and no Lakers in the build, right? So we pull this up and then go back to step 1. It looks like that player pool kind of gets reapplied here. It does. I wonder if it works the other way too. This build, I think we had more of an open player pool. I think. So let's see. Did we have LeBron and Giannis in this one? Yeah, we must have. Now let's go back here. Okay, so now they're back in the pool. So that might be one thing to look at there. TBK in particular. Maybe Chuck, this might be useful to you too. I don't know. I'm going to have to ask here and see if that's intended or not, or if that's a bug. It seems a little weird to me, but I kind of get it also, right? But that would be one thing to look at. If you are curating your player pool, yeah, the more I'm talking about this, the more that doesn't seem right. Because if you're running like a research build to research the slate with a wide open player pool, but then curating your player pool in step 1 for your actual lineups, if you went back to the research build just to look at it and then came back, your player pool would reset unless you went back to the build the player pool was curated. So that seems a little funky, actually, to me. That kind of now is seeming like a little bit of a bug here. So that is one thing I would, anyway, let me summarize here. I would watch out for this. If you do a lot of player pool curation, it looks like your player pool will kind of reset on step 1 if you go enter into a build where a different pool was used originally, right? So this build, this was the no Giannis, no Lakers build that we did right at the test at the start of the stream. And when we come back to step 1, So we can like go in here, we can let the lineups load. And then when we go back to step one, the player pool resets or it applies to what it was for that build. So that's what I would watch out there for, TBK. And I will report this to the rest of the team here, and we'll see if we can maybe clean this up, because even if it's somewhat intended, it's definitely not clear that it's happening here. So I'll talk to the team about this, but I would watch out for that for now. If you feel like if you're running a build and coming back to step one and the player pool is different than what you expected, if you go into a build where the player pool was right, it should go back to the way it was. So that is the first time I've noticed that, actually. I'm glad I managed to test that out here. But cool. Well, with all that said, I don't see any other questions coming in chat or in office hours. So I think what we'll do, we'll go ahead and leave it there for today. Let's see here. Let me go ahead. Yeah, I think we'll go ahead and leave it there for today. Thank you again to everybody that tuned in to office hours today or earlier in the week, all week. Happy Friday to everybody. We will be right back here again next week, same time, same place on Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern. So enjoy your weekend. Enjoy the rest of your Friday. Enjoy any DFS or sports you'll be watching this weekend. Should be a pretty fun one. Lots going on here. So until then, I will see you guys later. Take care. Thanks. Good luck.